James Madison declared war on Britain on June 18, 1812. The U.S. marched into Canada and assumed it would be an easy victory. Americans expected their Canadian brothers to rise up and throw off the shackles of an evil tyrant. But that was not the case. They won some battles and lost others. Britain landed on U.S. soil in 1814 and burned the White House to the ground. Despite this, Britain was pushed back and neither side gained anything from the war. So, the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 27, 1814, ending the war. Neither side won, but also neither side lost, so they were kind of satisfied with the result. There were many causes for the war, but it also should be made clear, Madison didn't jump right into this decision. He was not a warmonger. The War of 1812 was really a culmination of frustration against the British. Since the Revolution, they had been treating Americans pretty terribly in trade expeditions abroad in Europe. Britain was kidnapping U.S. sailors, forcing them to join their navy, and go die fighting Napoleon. In 1807, Britain's orders and councils required any American ships to stop in England before they could even trade with other European nations. The Brits put a trade blockade around France, which hurt the U.S. economy a lot. England was aiding Tecumseh, an American Indian, with guns and ammunition, and told them, hey, go fight and go kill these American settlers, because we don't want them taking this land. There were even rumors that Britain was sabotaging the U.S. tactile industry and illegally damaging U.S. livestock in the Northeast. And, on top of all of that, there were many war hawks in the U.S. who were like, you know what, Britain, screw you, we want to go to war. Another thing to remember is that this was not an isolated war. A big reason for why the U.S. declared war was that in 1812, Britain was already preoccupying this other guy called Napoleon. I don't know if you've heard of him. The war was not an easy decision for America, and it barely passed through the Senate. And, as with most things in America at that time, it was a North-South divide. Northern Federalists relied on trade with England, and a war would hurt that. They viewed Napoleon as a narcissistic dictator and a despot, and they opposed the war. Southern Democrat Republicans, I know that sounds funny now, romanticized Napoleon, and he was a peasant fighting against the corrupt aristocracy of the Old World, and they were for the war. In order for the U.S. to have had a chance at defeating Britain, a few things would have had to change, as it was very unlikely that America could have won if all the external factors surrounding the war were the same. Remember, wars at this point were not just isolated events taking place on a different continent. Everything had been interconnected with Europe. America was simply not strong enough or prepared enough for the war. Napoleon would have had to be in a better position in Europe. This would make an alliance with him strategically more valuable for the States, and it would mean Britain would have had to pull more troops out of Canada, definitely weakening it. France would have had to have been seen in a better light. Maybe Napoleon was viewed more favorably because he sold Louisiana to America. Maybe French aid during the American Revolution would have been more celebrated at this point too. Also, Jefferson would have had to have been more pro-army than he was. He was not in favor of a strong military and served before Madison, but if he encouraged it, things could have gone differently. In real life, many Americans opposed the standing army after the Revolution, and this was a major factor for the military shortcomings during the real War of 1812, as the U.S. was just not ready. All of these changes could have led to the war being more popular through the country, which in turn would have meant many of the militias in the Northeast who refused to fight would have now fought, giving the Union roughly 60,000 troops. Madison would still declare war on Britain on June 18, 1812, keying off the war. However, instead of attempting to march through Michigan, the U.S. would go through New York into Canada. The reason they didn't in real life is because they wanted to avoid the Federalists there, who opposed the war. General Stephen von Rensselaer defeated the British at the Battle of Queenston Heights on October 13, 1812, and went on to take Fort George, while Henry Dearborn captured Montreal by the end of the year. The English would capture Fort Detroit from American General William Hull under Major General Isaac Brock. After Hull surrendered to the Redcoats, William Henry Harrison, yes, the future president, took command of the Army of the Northwest. He marched north in January of 1813 to retake Detroit from Colonel Henry Proctor and Tecumseh, who were now working together and held command there. Harrison defeated the British at Frenchtown, which prevented the Potawatomi scalping of American prisoners that happened in real life there. Tecumseh was captured and killed, crippling the American Indian morale. Harrison continued north and retook Detroit from Proctor in a bloody conflict that would have cost both sides a ton of lives. Proctor managed to escape back east, though. This effectively put the British on a defensive for the rest of the war in the north. Von Rensselaer and Commodore Isaac Chauncey attacked York, the old name for Toronto, which was also the capital of Upper Canada, and defeated the British, who fled northward, giving the city up to the Americans. The British at Fort Erie abandoned it and escaped north before they were cut off. Chauncey then marched after them and met them at the Battle of Oxford and destroyed them. Over 1,500 Canadians were killed. The defeat caused the Iroquois to change side to the Americans, which almost took place in real life. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry won at the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813, giving the U.S. control over the lake, and boosted the American morale even more. Harrison then marched into Canada and won at the Battle of Thames on October 5, 1813. Proctor was killed during the battle. Many Loyalist Canadians began fleeing east to safety, and some even left to England. These American victories prevented the Chesapeake Campaign from taking place, as Britain was now focused on retaking Canada rather than attacking the Americans. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDougall captured Fort Mackinac on May 18, 1814, and sent many Indian allies to ambush American forces. Brock attacked York but failed to recapture the city and was forced to flee north again. The Indian attack on Fort Mims would still occur, with 400 American civilians, women and children mostly, being horrifically butchered and scalped. This would become a major rallying cry for the Americans against the natives during the war. Andrew Jackson defeated the Red Sticks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend on March 17th in retaliation. While this was going on, Harrison marched north and retook Mackinac from the British, and Major Zachary Taylor, another future president, won at the Battle of Credit Island, preventing a western front for the Redcoats from opening up. At this point, the British defeated Napoleon in Europe, which allowed them to bring more troops in, but Canada had almost already been completely taken, and over 75,000 people had fled back to England. On July 11, 1814, Thomas Masterman Hardy besieged Fort Sullivan but could not conquer the fort quickly as he wanted. At the Battle of Plattsburgh on September 11, 1814, Commandant Thomas MacDonough defeated the British reinforcements under Captain George Downey, who died during the battle, giving America control over Lake Champlain, preventing another British advance. General Alexander Macomb then attacked north, crushing Lieutenant General Sir George Prevost, who had to retreat east to Halifax. John Cope Sherbrooke led 3,000 British troops from Halifax on the Penobscot expedition to capture Fort Sullivan in September. Macomb marched east to meet Sherbrooke, and they fought at the Battle of Old Town. The battle was a decisive American victory, and Sherbrooke was killed alongside 2,000 of his men. Upon word of the American victory, Canadians in Nova Scotia fled in droves across the Atlantic. Macomb then marched south and massacred Masterman, lifting the siege of Fort Sullivan, and now Nova Scotia was completely undefended for America. Macomb marched into Nova Scotia, captured British ships and supplies, leaving Brock completely surrounded. Washington would not be burned in August of 1814, and there would be no siege of Fort McHenry, so Francis Scott Key's Star-Spangled Banner would never have been written. Let me know what you guys think the national anthem would have been for this America in the comments. The English still would have attacked New Orleans, as they viewed the Mississippi as being a crucial point for the war, and General Edward Pakenham went there with 8,000 men. The Battle of New Orleans took place on January 8, 1815, just as in real life. Jackson destroyed the British force before lifting the siege of Fort St. Philip. General John Lambert laid siege to Fort Bower on February 12th and captured it, securing Mobile as a base of operations for the British, but Jackson met him at the Battle of Cedar River. The battle was a resounding American victory, and Lambert was killed. At this point, the British were growing impatient and tired of the war. Many of their loyalist populations had already fled from Canada, and more importantly, Napoleon had just re-emerged as a major threat because he returned from his exile to Paris. While all of this was going on, the presidential election of 1816 would take place, and Madison was re-elected as the people were happy with his leadership and did not want a major change during an active war. He won in a landslide, crushing Rufus King, the Federalist candidate. This would have long-term implications for the U.S., as the precedent of serving 2 terms like Washington would not have existed for future presidents with extreme popularity like Andrew Jackson, and in turn, this would allow them to run for 3 or more terms. The Federalist Party would be crushed and disappear from politics as a result, as many saw them as being unpatriotic for opposing a war that was going so well in the first place. Now let's get into Madison's policy. The main issue during the 3rd term was slavery. This was a perfect time to slide in a deadline on slavery, and Madison would take it. At this point, most American troops were in Canada or defending the coast from the British Navy. Madison just won a landslide victory over the Federalists, and he was seen as a unifying figure for the entire Union. He was loved by Southerners and Northerners, and his popularity was at an all-time high. Another thing to consider is that none of the southern states had any men to secede with at the time. All their boys were up north fighting, so they would be in no position to secede. In real life, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the North and South agreed to push back talks of slavery 20 years and bring up the topic again. But it was pushed back once more in 1807. Madison was against slavery personally, even though he owned slaves during his life, but he did believe in a humanitarian treatment of them. The anti-slavery position is consistent with Madison, as in 1785, he favored a bill of Thomas Jefferson's that called for the gradual abolition of slavery. Madison viewed slavery as a repressive and barbaric practice. In our timeline, he proposed a ban for slavery in 20 years, so he was not making it an immediate issue for the South, but he was also solving the issue. This fit his political strategy and was also consistent with presidents at the time by kicking the issue down the road. This ban would not be drastic enough to make the South secede as a war was still going on with England, and he promised them land to expand south after conquering Canada. So there would never be a Missouri Compromise, but it was also made clear that slavery would end in 20 years. Congress would pass Madison's Slave Act of 1817 in June, supposedly ending the issue. Now, let's get back to the war. The lack of British troops at Waterloo would have led to a Napoleonic victory there. Napoleon would win a few battles as Britain was not as strong, so Britain pulled a lot of their remaining troops to Europe within the next year. Napoleon then fortified France's position to give himself time to regroup, train more men, and fight on. This opened up the Bahamas to Jackson, who landed there in July and captured all the islands for the U.S. in 1817. Both sides would be open to negotiations as they received word of recent Napoleonic victories in Europe. America wanted their land, and Britain saw France as a bigger danger than the States. Britain began negotiations with the U.S. under Henry Clay in 1818, when the Treaty of Lisbon was signed. Before word reached America, the last battle of the war took place. Brock met off against Macomb and Harrison at the Battle of McCusco. He was outnumbered 3-1 and died fighting with his men for his nation. He was a loyal servant to the crown till the end. The Treaty of Lisbon saw Britain cede all lands in Canada. Rupert's Land was given to the U.S. alongside the Bahamas, and Britain had to pay the Union $100 million. The U.S. granted safe passage to all Canadian loyalists back to England and saw over 100,000 Canadians leave. The Treaty of Adams-Onis would be signed by Clay in 1818, giving U.S. Florida from Spain. Madison would make it clear to the Europeans that this was the New World, it was America's world, and they needed to leave. So instead of it being known as Monroe's Doctrine, it would be known as the Madison Doctrine. Canada would not have any states for a few years, until it was populated with Americans and de-Anglified. Americans would move into the new lands and slowly drive away the Canadian spirit. This would happen within a few generations, just as loyalty to the crown had faded in Canada in the 1900s. The idea of Canada would slowly disappear, and they would begin to view themselves as Americans, just as someone today from Portland would view themselves as patriotic and American as someone from New York. The major issue here with this effect, though, would be Quebec. It was a former French colony and very Catholic. Something that, while technically allowed in America, was still discriminated against. America would most likely treat it the same way as they did with Louisiana, by pushing tons of American citizens there and Americanizing it. But they would also build up Montreal to be even larger, as it was critical for the American trade down the Lawrence River. There probably would be some revolts throughout Canada at first, but as more loyalists went back to England and Americans poured into Canada, they would grow weaker and weaker and peter out by the 1840s. The North would be pushing for 7 new states to be added to the Union, while the South could only add 3, so the South would push for more states to balance out power with the North, and in turn push for a war with Spain. Even if slavery was supposed to go away in the future, they would want more slave states in the moment, and plenty of other things could still be fought over in Congress and the Senate. The Spanish-American War now would have broken out in 1819, and this would have been super easy for the U.S. Remember, at this point, Spain was definitely on the decline. They'd just been humiliated by Napoleon. Many of their colonies in South America and even Mexico were declaring independence, so Spain was fracturing from within. Macdonald and Chauncey sailed to Cuba and conquered the islands within a few months. Madison would run for a 4th term, as he was popular in leading the U.S. through another war with a supposedly major European power, so nobody would have wanted to run against him. By 1821, America controlled Haiti and Puerto Rico. The Treaty of Moscow was signed in 1822 and gave the U.S. control over most of the Caribbean. White plantation owners quickly moved there and set up massive plantations. States like Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee saw tons of people move out to Florida, the Bahamas, Cuba, and Haiti to escape the less strict federal regulations and oversight on slavery. Madison would not run again in 1824, but he would be viewed as arguably America's best president. During his excellent presidency, he defeated two major European powers. He crushed England and got them out of North America and pushed Spain out of the Caribbean. He more than doubled the size of the U.S. and came up with a supposedly good solution for slavery, and was also known as the father of the Constitution, the documents that really bound the country together. Madison and Washington would be viewed similarly to how Caesar and Augustus were viewed by Romans. They were the quintessential gold standard that all future men and presidents should base themselves after. Monroe ran in 1824 and won. He was a perfect man for the job and was excellent at unifying people in real life, and this would be able to ease tensions between the new lands for the Union. He decreased the federal government and stayed out of state politics, which made everyone happy. Under Monroe, the territories that America had just conquered were given statehood as they had enough Americans at this point. The North got Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Madison, Quebec, Cape Breton, and Maine, which had recently just split from Massachusetts, though it's later in this timeline. The South got Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, the Bahamas, Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. So both regions gained 7 states, keeping things balanced. In real life, the era of good feelings started under Monroe and would still occur here. These people began viewing themselves as Americans and were proud of it. It's impossible to predict future elections really past this point, but I think someone from Monroe's cabinet would win, maybe Richard Rush, the Attorney General under Monroe, and a popular figure. The Democrat-Republican Party would not split during this election, as the issue of whether to support Jackson would not take place. Over time, the Whig Party, under Henry Clay, would become the main rival party, and would probably eventually change its name to something like the Patriot Party to distance themselves from the English Whigs. Popular American war heroes such as Jackson and Macomb would become presidents at some point and see more American expansion. During the Democrat-Republican control over the government, states would be given more freedom, and the Union would constantly be expanding, following the original Jeffersonian ideas that the party championed in real life. The individual freedom would appease both the Deep South and new Northern states, but it was also made clear to the South, slavery would end. This period of dominance by the Democrat-Republicans would be similar to the period after the Civil War, when Republicans had 8 of the 10 presidents up to 1912. The next major issues for the states would have been in 1836, under President Macomb, a northerner from New York. Texas recently won their independence from Mexico and sought to join the Union. Texas never would have allowed slavery because of this, but it still wouldn't have been admitted initially. Most Americans moving to Texas would have known that slavery was going to be illegal soon, so the practice wouldn't have ever been popularized. It had also now been 20 years since Madison's slavery ban was supposed to be taking effect, and slavery was supposed to be abolished in 1836. However, the Deep South would still utterly refuse to abandon the practice, and slavery would have been, however, less popular, though. States like Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee probably wouldn't have joined these Confederates. Also, the idea of seceding would not have been as popular as they had already agreed 20 years ago to abolition, so it wouldn't have garnered the same support. The idea of states' rights would be very different, as the Democrat-Republicans had granted tons of liberties and stayed out of local politics, so putting down their foot over one issue was not viewed as another of many federal overreaches. This version of the Civil War would have been much smaller and probably less deadly. Many states would still secede, but not to the extent in our time. Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Florida, Arkansas, Missouri, the Bahamas, Cuba, Haiti, and Puerto Rico probably all would have succeeded. However, the push to preserve the Southern way of life would not be as strong. Instead of the 3% of Southerners who owned slaves in 1860, it would be less than 1%, as the practice had already been waning out. The Confederates would quickly lose war within 2 or 3 years, and in 1840, President Macomb pushed Congress to admit Texas into the Union. When the U.S. added Texas, the Mexican-American War would have broken out just as it did in real life. America would have crushed Mexico, and Macomb probably would have pushed for more land and annexed deeper south, taking all of California. As time went on, America pushed further west, and eventually reached from sea to shining sea, and would eventually buy Alaska from Russia on March 30th, 1867, uniting most of North America under the Stars and Stripes. The U.S. would be very anti-European in general, but especially towards England. England would be bitter towards America, and they would also always have tension between the two, and they wouldn't have really healed in the late 1800s as they did in real life, because the U.S. had beat them in 2 wars and left them, very mad. The U.S. would be more self-reliant and isolationist, and Europe would become more unimportant to America as the American economy was really big enough to be self-sufficient. The population for the U.S. would have exploded in the late 1800s, and cities would span all through the nation. Different regions would develop their own characteristics, but as America was so large, trade could have been mostly internal while still spanning almost an entire continent. Despite all that, in 1914, the Great War would still break out, and the U.S. would not have close ties to England, France, or Germany, so they may have followed the Madison Doctrine and set out the war. What do you think would have happened in this World War I? Who do you think the U.S. would have allied with, if anyone? And just remember, while the War of 1812 is an afterthought in most history books, if things had gone slightly differently, the world as we know it would look very, very different. The long-term effects of winning in 1812 would be drastic. Comment and let me know you think how history would have changed if America won the War of 1812. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please let me know if you have any full-fledged video ideas for the future. And if you want to gain access to any of the maps used in the video, check out my Patreon. Click here to check out some of my other videos, and I hope you guys have a blessed day.